We're going into our discussion and question time now. So we're welcoming Phoebe back to the virtual stage. Um, and feel free to post questions in chat or in the Q&A. And if you're up for being put on screen to ask your question in person, then we can do that too. Great, let's get everything together and just check the questions for a moment. I kind of want to spotlight several people, but I'm going to leave the spotlighting to Zarina, who is the tech expert here. Alicia, you have a question. Would you like to join us on stage, or are you happy just staying in chat? Let's just dive straight in with that question. Anyway, thank you for it. So, Phoebe, do you think less progressive councils than Camden, where people with underserved needs live, like Haringey or Peckham, just to stick with London, might they be open to the moral imagination training? And have you had any contact or experience with that sort of council?
Thank you. It's a great question. I have had contact and have worked with other councils before who have had, as you say, Camden is definitely one of the more well-resourced boroughs. And so we've done work with other councils, but not been able to do that deeper, longer-term work in order to create the kinds of models and resources of how this works in a council context. So our thinking is really to work with Camden so that we can then work with other councils, like the councils that you name, the ones with underserved needs, here, Haringey, Peckham. But yeah, we actually started with working with the community of Watchet, which is an area of the UK in Somerset, which has one of the lowest mobility scores in the whole of the UK. So I don't think this work at all is inaccessible. In fact, what I found is working with communities who are surviving with a lot less, that the imagination there is very alive. It's incredibly alive, and it's alive and kicking, whereas actually in places where there's a lot more resource, I notice imagination muscles are a bit more atrophied or like weakened. There's less of that muscle. So there's definitely not a capacity issue, but just in terms of how we sequence this. We're hoping our work with Camden can ripple out to other councils as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Great answer.
I just wanted to say as well, I've really loved your talk, Liz, and I almost felt like if yours had gone first, it was almost like you set up this, you gave this context around the need for like new spiritual practice and infrastructure, and I just felt like, almost back to front, but it was really good.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really nice to sort of feel the themes between our two perspectives, for sure.
Liz, I'm sure the Unitarian Church must be quite new to a lot of people who are joining us today. Could you talk a bit more about why it's still described as a church rather than a movement? Because I think church has a very specific feeling for folks. And that might not be what you're describing, which sounds.
That's a great point, and it's definitely one that we chew over a lot ourselves, and it is often called a Unitarian movement. And I've also had people say to me, we shouldn't call ourselves a movement. So we use movement, church, denomination, community. It's people. The language is really difficult because, of course, everyone has their own relationship with religion, whether positive or negative or mixed and complicated. And of course, the language that goes with that can have a huge amount of baggage. I remember when I first started going to the congregation in Newington Green in North London, I found it really hard to use church language. Words like church and congregation and things like that, it would stick. And I got used to it, and now I'm very comfortable with it. But it's always really helpful to meet with other people who do have, for lots of good reasons, lots of discomfort with religious language. And I think that's part of this sort of bridging work to sort of show actually the things that we're talking about are universal. of course, there's different language and different practices depending on, you know, your cultural heritage and your experience, but trying to find the commonalities, it takes a little bit more time. People can be put off by the sort of, even a building that looks like a church, people can be like, I can't go in there, and totally understand that. It's a really interesting thing to try and navigate.
Yeah, we have a great question from Richard Sanford, and do feel free to jump in on voice or video, Richard, if you would like to ask it yourself. We'd love to see some more faces.
I mean, I'm riddled with cold, so I don't know if I'm adding very much, but just for the sake of showing that there's more than the three of you, I'm just really struck by the overlaps between, you know, on the one hand, the word spiritual framing, you know, this kind of hundreds of years old church-based narrative, and this idea of moral. And I just wondered what sort of dialogue you might both have about why choose each of those words? Where are they the same? There is a kind of an axiological, ethical kind of imperative to both of them, but at the same time, they do seem to have quite different flavors. And I just wondered if you could speak to that. And thanks both. Marvelous talks. Really enjoying this. Loads to think about and digest.
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, why did you choose moral? I'm really interested.
Yeah, I get that a lot. I get asked that a lot, and you know, a lot of the where do I even start? The point that Liz was making about language is really, really important, and has been the choice of moral imagination was done very carefully, because you know, the work that I'm doing and we're building as moral imaginations could easily be labeled like spiritual ecology or deep ecology or kind of neo-spirituality, and I can see a lot of really, really great work that is happening in those areas, and it named and labeled as such. They reach a certain kind of person, and that's great. I'm really interested in how we can reach different kinds of people that are not currently being reached by the work of say, Joanna Macy and the spiritual ecology movement. And so I see my role as a bit of a bridge, actually coming up with terminology or language like imagination activism that can create a bridge where people are experiencing such practices and work, but don't label it as spiritual ecology, and they don't need to. They're just experiencing something that is transformative for them in a certain way. But having been through our labs, they suddenly become really open to things that maybe seemed a little bit more woo-woo or a little bit, you know, foreign and weird. So I really see us as that bridge. And the reason I chose moral imagination, like I would never use the word moral without the imagination next to it, because for me, moral has connotations of righteousness and a kind of black or white, like there's a right and wrong, and so there's that's different for everybody. So there's a pluralism that is kind of inherent in that people have their own morals, but the partnering of moral with imagination for me is about you know, imagination is this boundless, not black or white thing, this thing that's very free and infinite, and yet imagination without any bounds gave us the atomic bomb, or it gave us, you know, awful things that have happened in history. Imagination is not a biased thing towards creating more positive futures. So for me, there's a need to bound that in something that puts values at the heart. So that's why it's called moral imagination, because I'm trying to get at that combination of being a kind of warrior for life and a protector of what is sacred, and being in the imagination of possibility. I'm really curious to hear your response, Liz, and just to say, Liz and I have been in a kind of slow conversation over email and calls over the last year, just about, you know, the connections between our work. So this is really, really nice to have this chance to dive into some of this.
Yeah, it's the word spiritual is really challenging as well, because it can mean so many different things to different people, and like Phoebe said, the word moral on its own can feel challenging as well, of being that sort of black and white or sort of top down imposition of values and beliefs, and that's really counter to the Unitarian worldview, which is much more democratic, I suppose. And that's something that feels really important to me, is that the world that we're in now is so different from a few hundred years ago, when there was in Britain much more of that sort of top-down moralism of, everyone has to conform to these ideas of, religion and values and what's right and wrong. We can't go there right now in this country, and neither would we want to. But something that's been important to Unitarianism has been the idea of reason and conscience, and people discerning for themselves what's valuable, what's true, what's right. And one of the founders of British Unitarianism was Joseph Priestley, who was also a scientist and discovered oxygen, as well as being a Unitarian minister. And so those different ways of knowing, those different types of knowledge, have always been part of our practice. And so it's sort of spirituality with a rational side, not seeing those two things as separate, which I think can feel quite strange to a lot of people in Britain today in their understanding or expectations of religion. So yeah, the language is so tricky, and that's why it's so great to have like these different kinds of spaces where we can open things up a little bit more and sort of duck underneath the language on the surface and talk about what do we really mean underneath this? What does it mean for our lives? What does it mean for how we do things?
Thank you. I'm going to pick out another question, and folks, do feel free to ask in the chat if you've got anything you would like to share. Richard Gull, do you want to join us, or would you like me to read out your question? There you are.
Yeah, sure. No, I'll read it out. No, thank you both for some really interesting talks. Yeah, hang on. Sorry, let me find my question. Yeah, so this is mainly for Phoebe, but maybe you both want to comment. So how can we ensure that, like creating spaces and conversations about imagination, particularly in workplaces, can create like real change rather than say like strengthening, say, the status quo? And I put it another way as well. So how do you manage the balance, I guess, between challenge and reconciliation when it comes to imagination?
What a beautiful question. Richard, would you mind saying a bit more about that piece on challenge and reconciliation, just because it feels like a very rich...
Yeah, I'll try to. So I guess it's kind of, so to what extent do we use imagination as a way of kind of reconciling things, or kind of finding ways through things, or to what extent do we use it? And I think this actually does relate to a response you had to a question just now. To what extent does it can we use it as a way of challenging or actively sort of changing things, or
got it.
Yeah, forcing a way through things, I guess?
Yeah, great question. So I talk quite a lot about positive disruption, because within workplace settings, actually, this might be a good place to share that slide, which I finished on, which I do think would be really good to share. So when I'm working with people on kind of embedding imagination into place, we really focus on this thing of imagination being a muscle that can be built, which I think is it's a new concept for most people. They don't think of imagination as something that is a capacity that can be grown. And so we talk about the three things that can increase, create space for this: time and space, permission, and then scaffolding with prompts and exercises. Very simple three things. But just to focus in on this second one, of permission. So permission is something that permission to imagine and to be radical and to come up with ideas that actually disrupt and potentially go against the grain is often withheld in performance cultures in organizations. There's a definite sort of don't rock the boat tendency towards the status quo, which is understandable because people need to get things done. There is a careful balance while we're still in society of capitalism. Going to work is about creating products or achieving progress or achieving linear goals. Going to work is not about it's not centered on your own capacity and building capacity and creativity and like just creating ideas, that will come. I hope that's definitely part of what I hope to see in the future. But there's a balance right now about creating the space and the kind of protected space to be really radical and really disruptive, and then allow that to kind of channel in to actually what do we need to get done. So there's this kind of goal-oriented culture. And my hope is that, you know, if we imagine just kind of train tracks of like the way things just always are, if we create these spaces that actually shakes things up and encourages people to be really disruptive and brave and rebellious in a way that's allowed, it can help and give people the tools as well to then translate that into like changing things gently, because you don't want to kind of break everything, but it's about creating the space to be rebellious and then equipping and empowering people to be able to take that into what they need to do, and hopefully then changing things more systemically. And also we do a lot of kind of embedding into kind of organizational policy, so it's not just about an experience, it's about how do you actually change the culture and policy of the organization to be more open to the fact that like we are facing massive challenges, so therefore, and the ways that we're doing things right now is not working, so therefore things have to change really radically, so you have to create space for that.
I wanted to jump in and bring in Liz at that point, because I think some of this also highlights the tension that, Liz, you talked about, where you have aging congregations which are shrinking and getting older, and yet clearly a mission that still feels very relevant for the modern era. How do you balance this sort of desire for change and firing up the imagination and coming up with change with the maintenance of what's been traditionally important in your existing kinship communities and congregations?
It's so challenging. It's I think it does come down to trust of, you know, how these sort of, you know, multi-generational communities, you know, that are passed on, you know, through the centuries. I think they do work from that trust between the generations of passing on the baton. And what we're experiencing now, and what a lot of churches are experiencing, is that there's a few generations missing. And so the older folk who've been stewarding these communities and are holding the baton, they haven't had the next generations to pass it on to. And so now there's this bigger gap to bridge. And I think that's part of the challenge that we're seeing is how do we build that trust? But also I think it's about creating the conditions for new things to emerge that are rooted in the same ethos. You know, that you can sort of see the links. Oh yeah, this is part of the same thing, even if there is a sort of a gap in that continuity. You know, something new growing from bare ground, kind of thing. But something else that I just wanted to reflect on with Richard's question was about it really, you know, the thing about the status quo versus, you know, culture change. I suppose it feels like one of the worst things that a spiritual community can do is to kind of provide comfort for people as they continue with the damaging status quo. And, you know, there's quite a lot of, you know, with things like mindfulness being sort of very mainstream as a sort of spiritual practice and in lots of workplaces, and there's lots of, you know, mindfulness for bankers kind of things where it's like, okay, you're using this spiritual technology to kind of improve productivity or whatever in something that is not aligned to the common good. And I think it's such an important thing to be conscious of, to sort of see like, yes, you know, that we need to be able to provide that place of comfort for people in crisis, for people in need of support, but also we need to be challenging ourselves to be looking at, are our actions aligned to the common good? And so that so easily runs into those kind of power dynamics. And yeah, again, can be very sensitive and can be very challenging.
Yeah, interesting. I've seen a few examples recently talking about where particularly perhaps, and this is my background coming from tech, but where big corporates, particularly perhaps technology ones in California, are starting to perhaps replace other forms of community by getting people into the workplace and trying to offer everything that you might need there, not just your laundry and your food, but also perhaps, as you say, mindfulness exercises, and sort of replacing what was previously other forms of community, spiritual community, local communities, and so on, with this sort of workplace corporatized community, which feels a little bit like sort of corporate community washing, to reflect Phoebe's point about imagination washing. They feel sort of similar ideas of how do communities connect and form, and what are the motivations behind them. Paulina, do you want to join us? I see your hand is up. Come on in.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Phoebe and Liz, for fantastic talks. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me? Have I unmuted myself? Because I have like a window telling me I haven't. Okay, thank you. So I have a question that maybe follows on from that. And as I was listening, when we're thinking about connections and community creation and creating spaces for imagination, and I kept wondering about kind of the relationship between space, the physicality of space, and making and rooting practices in spaces, versus whether we can achieve that by moving and utilizing technologies. And I'm wondering whether you have any reflection on what, and I think pandemic has taught us quite a few things, encouraging us to move in one direction or the other, and fail as well. And I think from my work in the UK during the pandemic, I know that actually Unitarian Church was really quick in moving into that online space and kind of bringing their congregations into those spaces, and struggled less than other communities. And again, the communities that are more ephemeral, like pagans, like Buddhists, who are already kind of relying on networks, who are already geographically dispersed, they kind of have better tools for maybe adapting and kind of coming together to nurture those connections. But I'm wondering whether having spaces, physical spaces, or not having them is a hindrance or something that might push imagination for us. I hope that makes sense.
Well, I'm interested in Phoebe's experience of that, but we find that buildings can be an incredible asset and an incredible hindrance as well. And we did find that some congregations during pandemic, when they didn't have to worry about their building, they could breathe a sigh of relief, and they could focus on the community elements without worrying about who's going to unlock the building, who's going to do whatever practical stuff. They could sort of put that out of their minds and were freed up a little bit more. But I think, as we've all also experienced over the last couple of years, there's nothing quite like being in the same physical space as people.
Yeah, I think what's been really interesting with the pandemic is that our understanding of how in-person time can be used and what we should use in-person time for is shifting rapidly. I was actually before the pandemic, I worked part of a global, decentralized network of freelancers called Inspiral, where we worked together on projects, but we only met twice a year. And so in terms of decentralized organizing practice, really valuing in-person time as that time just to kind of get to know each other, to really spend quality time together somewhere beautiful, like in nature, or to really make use of that time and what is possible when you are in a room together, but not defaulting to in-person just for all meetings, because it's a huge amount of effort and it's tiring for people and it's ableist, and it's there's a lot there that you can just do online in the comfort of your own home. And actually what we found is during the pandemic, when we ran all of these processes and community online, in some ways a greater intimacy was created because we had all of these shared digital spaces. Some of the tools we use are kind of these shared collective creativity digital spaces that continue to exist even after the session. And so we had this experience of a shared kind of imagination space that lasted continually, that people would dip into and out of and drop things and drop ideas. And so there's this sense of things that are possible online that aren't possible in person. And also for things like our Interspecies Council, I think it actually helped a lot of people be able to get into character, being able to change their name on the Zoom screen, you can use masks, you can do all sorts of things. So there's a lot of potential, I think, for us in terms of where we take the creative media side of this, like as we build capacity to do things maybe in a higher tech way, we can be working with virtual reality. I think there's probably quite a lot that we can do, but always maintaining that physical animal body part and how important that is. Hope that answers the question. And really excited to hear your talk, Paula.
I'll try.
I'm just checking to see if we've got any other questions from the audience. Because one thing that really struck me in both of your talks was that sense of generations, of maintaining across quite a long time scale, whatever generations means, whether that's sort of kinship or family generations or congregation generations, but maintaining something. And as Liz mentioned, some of that maintenance also being about change and identifying what you're going to change, but also what is sustained through that sort of thread through life. And I wondered whether either of you had other examples of things you think are interesting where things are being maintained long term through different kinds of generations, whether or not some pieces of them are changing. Are there other examples that folks here might be interested in checking out and learning more about? Where do you draw inspiration from?
My fallback is nature. Just I remember when I visited like the redwoods in California, and I think we're only just starting to understand perception, and embodied cognition is something that is finally kind of getting a scientific backing, and books like The Body Keeps the Score and others. And when I imagine back to spending the afternoon in the redwoods and the feeling that gave me of timelessness and kind of thousands, that really long time perspective, not quite thousands of years, hundreds of years, but in some cases a very large number of years. But it's a feeling of timelessness. It's a sense of stillness and ancientness. And I think science can then be used as well to bring in, I draw a lot of inspiration from molecular biology, microbiology, evolutionary history, because I think really, really understanding facts like, when you're with a tree and you can feel the feeling of timelessness and ancientness, but then when you actually think logically about when was this tree alive, what was happening in human history, like what other humans have touched this tree, like there's a way of harnessing the tools of the mind and the rational mind to kind of bring some of that in.
I think also it's maybe tricky to think of examples, because
it's tricky.
I think that some of the best examples are the things that aren't really the stuff of history books. And I was thinking about the difference between the sort of, when you're planning long-term, multi-generational, you are imposing on the future. There's a power dynamic going on there, compared to the holding the ethos and the values that will allow you to have a continuity through time, but without trying to decide what's going to be the right thing to do in 100 years' time. And it reminded me of someone was doing some family tree research in my family, and it was learning about, I think it's a great great grandmother of mine, who was illiterate. She had 10 children. She lived in a small village in Somerset, and she was a midwife. And she also helped with funerals. And because she was illiterate, everything she learnt about those practices would have been learnt from another person. And of course, thinking about my background in sort of medical publishing, that was all about writing guidelines, documenting protocols, capturing the process so that is handed on. Totally different to all of time before that, where midwifery, for example, was taught person to person. And so I think it's more those examples where there's the wisdom, the knowledge is passed on with the values that will shift slightly in an evolutionary way, generation to generation. And so so it feels hard to think of the sort of specific examples because they're not the kind of things that are sort of captured in history books.
Well, that was a beautiful way to wrap up this session. Perhaps we are part of a new oral tradition of passing on stories of maintenance in this community. Thank you both so much, Phoebe and Liz, for that fascinating exploration of maintenance, of hope and kinship and more.